Hello, everyone, and good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Spencer Ruckty. I'm the author events manager at Third Place Books here in Seattle, Washington. And on behalf of Third Place Books, I'd like to welcome you to this wonderful group reading of a new anthology, a new annual anthology called Best Literary Translations this year in its first rendition, published by Deep Vellum Books, a wonderful publisher based out of Dallas, Texas, of world literature. Today we have with us editor Kola Túbọ sún with readings from translators and contributors Sherod Santos, Edith Adams, and Jeanine Legato. Thank you so much again for watching. And to those of us out there, or to those of you out there, feel free to say hello in the chat window at the bottom of your screen. And do let us know where you're calling in from, because that's always fun to see. Editor No Anathai was originally scheduled to join us, but unfortunately is unable to make it because of an injury earlier this morning. So if you see No, please wish him well in his recovery. Third Place Books hosts well over 250 in-person author events a year, but of course we could not pass up on this opportunity to reopen our Zoom for this celebration of this anthology. So you can sign up for our email newsletter at thirdplacebooks.com for more occasional virtual events like these, or if you're in Seattle, we have an incredible lineup this year. And again, you can go check that out on our website. As mentioned, that chat window is open at the bottom of your screen, and we encourage you to use it respectfully today. And then during the last 15 to 20 minutes or so, we will also have time for your questions. So do be thinking of those. If you have questions for any of our translators or our editor this evening, you can submit those to the Q&A window below, which is separate from the chat window at the bottom of your screen. And a reminder that this event will be recorded, so if you have to miss anything, we'll be emailing a recording to everyone who is registered. And of course, you can order the best literary translations of 2024 from your neighborhood independent bookstore. Every purchase you make truly does support the future of our author series. Purchasing this book also is just like a vote for literary translation in this country, especially new translation. It is vital to our literary communities. So I just want to thank you just for attending today, and hope you enjoy this presentation. The Best Literary Translations Anthology is a new anthology, as mentioned, published by Deep Vellum, that celebrates world literature and English translation and honors the translators and literary journals who create and publish this work, because it is no small feat. And this inaugural anthology, of course, which I'm holding in my hands, contains work written in 19 different languages, many of which, as a bookseller, I very rarely encounter in English, including such languages as Burmese and Kurdish and Wayu. The four series co-editors of this anthology, No Anathai, Wendy Call, Oiku Tekten, and Kola, who is here with us tonight, selected the finalists from over 500 nominations. And now here to talk about the anthology itself, we have one of its editors, Kola, who's going to take it away and introduce a few of our contributors as well. Kola Túbọ sún is a Nigerian writer and linguist, and is the publisher of alongoafrica.com and the author of two poetry collections, Edwardsville by Heart and Igba Uwe. He is a Fulbright scholar and a Chevening Research Fellow at the British Library in London, and his work in language advocacy earned him the Premio Astana Special Prize in 2016. So please join me in welcoming Kola.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Kola. I am currently in Minnesota. I'm happy to hear from all of you. And of course, if you want to put where you're from in the chat box, that would be nice to know where all of us are calling from. I'm very excited to be here today. Fortunately, we couldn't have Noah, who was supposed to be here. And there are four of us. There's Noah, there's Wendy Call, whose idea this all was. And then there's Oiku Tekten, who is based in Turkey and sometimes Spain, sometimes New York. And the four of us usually have to read through hundreds and hundreds of submissions, and then come to a short list, and then hand them over to the guest editor, who then chooses the final final works that appeared in the book. What do I have to say? Just that I was hoping to have a short interaction with Noah to talk about our process of coming to this conclusion, but I guess now I'm just going to rant about just generally just share my own journey with with the best literary translations, which I came to about 3 years ago when they were looking for an African co-editor. And then, of course, by then we already had Noor, who was the Asian co-editor, Wendy, who was the co-editor for, I think, the Americas, and then Oiku, who was for Europe and the Middle East. And thankfully, I got on the list. And I have been, the idea of having a book that celebrates translation is something that I have been interested in for a long time. And so coming across a project of this nature was something that I found really, really interesting, and I was very excited to be part of. And of course, also to find a home in Deep Vellum was something that, we really enjoyed and was happy to find. And the process of having to read through all of these exciting work from different languages and to judge, which is something I always found, very humbling. The quality of work and translation from one language to the other, having to decide, what to prioritize in the quality of translation into a language, a second language, or the quality of the work itself, even in the original language or in the destination language, and all the conversations we have about, which work deserves to go in, which one deserves to stay behind. When sometimes you have to choose between competing choices, is something that has become now an annual thing to look forward to. We have selected for the next edition, and we've handed them over to our guest editor, who is Cristina Rivera Garza, who won the Pulitzer Prize this year, actually, after she had done the work for our anthology, which made us very excited, and we look forward to, seeing the second edition of the book. I'm happy to be here today and to meet with some of the contributors and to hear from them, read some of their work, and talk about the process of translation, which is also something I really, really find interesting, hearing from authors about choices they have to make, why they chose this author, what kind of challenges they had while doing the translation, and actually hear them in their own words read this work to us. So today we have a few of the translators in the book. I'm going to read their profile, and then we'll give them a chance to talk about their work and to read from them. I'm starting with Edith Adams, alphabetically by last name, as we list them in the book, who is from Phoenix, a literary translator working primarily between Spanish and English. She's a PhD candidate in comparative literature at the University of Southern California and an alumna of the Bread Loaf Translators Conference and the Banff International Literary Translation Center. The translation work has appeared in Guerrilla, Latin American Literature Today, New England Review, Northwest Review, Words Without Borders, and elsewhere. You're welcome, Edith. Next is Disney Cardoso, I believe. No, Disney is the original writer. The second.
Yeah, that's me.
Yeah, it's Jeanine Legato.
Jeanine, yeah.
Jeanine, sorry, give me a second to find your bio here and mark down your author instead. That's my fault. Jeanine is a translator, interpreter, and researcher based in Bogota. She specializes in Colombian literary and academic translation, particularly pertaining to issues of human rights and armed conflicts. Okay, she'll tell us more about that. And finally, we have poet, playwright, and translator Sherod Santos, who is the author of 7 books of poetry, a book of essays, and a book of translations from the early Greek poets, a National Book Award, a New Yorker Book Award, and National Book Critic Award finalist. He received an award in literature from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. You're all welcome. Happy to see you here. Shall we start with Edith to read from her work, which I think is titled, well, she's going to introduce the work and tell us more about it.
Sounds great.
I'm going to mute myself now.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much to everyone for being here. It's really, really exciting to see familiar faces and meet new translators whose work I read, but haven't had a chance to meet. So thank you so much for just creating this space. And thanks to Third Place Books for hosting this event. It's really exciting to be here in support of the inaugural editions of Best Literary Translations. So today I will be reading 3 poems by the Mapuche Chilean author Daniela Catrileo. And I thought that since they're relatively short poems, I would take a moment just to provide a little bit of context about Daniela and her work, and then a little bit of context about the broader project from which these poems derive. So for those who are unfamiliar, the Mapuche constitute the largest indigenous community in the country today known as Chile. And Daniela Catrileo has in recent years become really a kind of a central voice in both Chilean letters and Mapuche cultural production. She works across a wide variety of genres. She is a visual and performance artist. She writes poetry. She has a new novel. She writes short stories, but she also writes critical essays and is a professor of philosophy. So she wears a lot of hats. But across all of her work, she's really interested in thinking about the contours and multiplicities of what it means to be Mapuche today, particularly in the wake of exile, migration, and colonization, both historical and ongoing. So the translations that I'm going to be reading today were originally published in New England Review, and they're excerpted from a larger project that in English we're calling Guerrilla Blooms, and that's a translation of Catrileo's 2018 poetry collection that was originally titled Guerra Florida, or Rayo Leche Malón in Mapudungun. Originally appearing in print in a bilingual Spanish and Mapudungun edition, Guerrilla Blooms reimagines the arrival of the colonizers from the perspective of an indigenous woman who, alongside her partner and a collective of other women warriors, takes up arms against them. The collection, which is comprised of individual poems that are connected by a kind of larger overarching narrative, which is the one that I just described, subverts the dominant narrative of colonization that is traditionally told from the perspective of the invaders. So rather than present this kind of singular or teleological account of colonization, the poems unfold across these really kind of vertiginous landscapes and chronologies. So what I mean by that is that she collapses time and space in really interesting ways in this collection. And in so doing, frames colonial violence not as this kind of single completed event, but rather as a sort of much more expansive imposition of ideologies and imaginaries that continue to shape ways of being and knowing to this day. And you'll see that in some of the poems that I'll be reading today. And this is really important, right? Because this articulation of colonization emerges from the realities facing Mapuche communities today, who continue to confront neo-colonial violence through rampant extractivism, police brutality, and continued struggles over their land, language, and rights. I'm also, shameless plug here, but I'm very excited because the complete collection of these poems will be coming out in English this fall through Eulalia Books. It'll be the first of Daniela's work to be available in English. So this has been a very long labor of love, so I'm really excited that it'll finally be out in the world. So these particular excerpts thematize problems of language and naming that continue well after the formal end to colonial rule. Selfishly, they're also some of my favorite poems from the collection, so I hope that you enjoy them. And without further ado, I'll get started. And these are all untitled, so I'll just pause between each of the poems. It's hard to say, is this a taper or is this fear? I can't decide if the image existed in this universe of things, because taper and fear lay outstretched in repose to the eclipse prior to their words, just as I was also myself before the creation of this poem. We carry traces of blood stamped upon gold and brown skin, a painting that sketches the map of the stars. That is our language, not a word that imitates, but a figure that's traced. A frenzy of vultures waits till we fall. How many sisters have fallen already? I look toward the hills, black clouds, and plantations. We don't have a marching band, but once it rained fish. I ask myself what would have happened if they had never arrived. They, he, which word to name, which land to maim. I don't know if we are catastrophe or the dream of the absent bird. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to speak a bit about the process?
Yeah, sure. So one of the challenges of this collection and Daniela's work as a whole is that Daniela speaks only Spanish. She didn't grow up as a bilingual speaker. As an adult, she's been learning Mapudungun. So her work is really inflected with a lot of sort of rhythms of Mapudungun and Mapuche cosmologies, but she is not a bilingual speaker. And so one of the challenges of translating her work is when she writes in Spanish, even though she's writing in Spanish, so much of her Spanish is inflicted with kind of the rhythms of Mapudungun, even if it's written in Spanish itself. So for a lot of these, I listened to recordings over and over again of her reading this collection, or asked her kind of to read certain parts so I could get a feel for how the poem sounded. And then she would put emphases on certain moments that when I read the Spanish simply on the page, I wasn't getting that sort of emphasis, or I heard the poem totally differently when I heard her read it. And so trying to find a way in my own translation to think, and obviously we do this so much, right, when we translate poetry, but think not just about the meaning or the words on the page, but think about how it sounds and kind of where I heard her putting emphases or thinking about very different rhythms and inflections of her Spanish and how that changed my translation process. So yeah, a big part of my process of translating was listening to recordings of her reading and trying to almost internalize that rhythm and then see how I could bring that out in the English.
Very interesting. How did you choose the author?
Really just a very fortuitous encounter. I read this collection in 2020 and I fell in love with it, and I thought it was one of the best poetry collections I'd ever read. And I'm a translation student at USC, and so I started translating it within the confines of a class, and I fell in love with it so much that I just kept translating it and started it in 2020. So it's been a very long process, but I just think her work is really extraordinary and wanted other people to be able to encounter it. There's also incredibly few Mapuche authors who are available in translation, and a lot of translations of Chilean work don't provide any insight to the kind of important cultural contributions of Mapuche authors and creators. So I felt that was really important to bring into translation.
Thank you so much.
Thank
I think
you.
there will be a chance for people to ask questions towards the end of the reading. So we shall thank you so much for sharing that with us. Let's go to Jeanine now, who will read her work, I believe, titled The Snail Spiral. As much as you can read for us and as much as you can talk about the process. Off to you.
Sure. I think I might prefer to start with the reading. Can you all hear me? I'm off mute, right? Yeah.
We can hear you.
Cool. I think I prefer to start with the reading, and then at the end, I might make some remarks. So this is The Snail Spiral. It was written by Disney Cardoso, who's a co-signer of the Colombian peace agreement between the former FARC-EP and the Colombian government. Here it goes. I met Gato 6 months after joining the guerrilla. We saw each other for the first time in La Llaneta, a rural settlement near Marquetalia. We were attending a training for new recruits, and he and I were covered in mud from head to toe. We couldn't stop looking at each other, intuiting a certain complicity, or maybe the common solitude of those of us who arrive young to the guerrilla. The afternoon drawing to a close, we went for a swim in one of the nearby rivers. We began talking as the water cleansed our faces, and right then we knew we would be friends. We were 15 years old and laughed uncontrollably as we tore through the landscape that, through play, revealed itself to us. One afternoon, as we were making chontos, the trees dug in the earth in the middle of the jungle, we saw the snails for the first time. They were as big as coins, and their shells had spirals that slowly receded before culminating in a center beyond view. Gato and I looked at each other, began gathering them in our hands, and tossed them at one another, chucking and ducking, laughing, lobbing them again. At that moment, Gato came up with the game with which we would horse around on so many days that followed this one. It was simple. We traced a square in the earth and put various snails in it. I held another snail in my hand, stroking it with my fingertips, warming it in my grip, and then threw it at the square so it would collide there with another. One life against another. The one who managed to break one of the shells within the square won, breaking the spiral. I had attempted suicide 5 times. That was before joining the guerrilla. It's just that so many things went on in my house. My sister didn't love me, for example, and when my mom left with her partner for weeks on end, she would take control and throw me out of the house. On those days, I had to sleep up in a mango tree. The nights, the days, the water, the heat. It's incredible how a neglected person adapts to any situation. For this reason, when the guerrilla passed by my house, I went running after them so that they would take me. The commander leading the unit said that I was too young, but I insisted that I was already 15, that I would never regret having gone. I told them about everything going on in my house, the days and nights, and they finally agreed. I didn't want to look back. Today, I can still remember Gato in great detail. I squint my eyes and see him beside me. He had light hair and green eyes framed by abundant lashes. I remember his many freckles and his nose that sloped into a small nub capable of predicting flare-ups in the weather. His sister, who, for practical reasons, we called Gata, was much shorter than he and wore her hair shoulder length. They both shared those freckles and the trenches, and it was odd not to see them together at any hour of the day. She had protruding canine teeth, which is perhaps why she hardly smiled. Gato, on the other hand, would laugh at the slightest opportunity. I can remember him, snail in hand, and his nervous gaze when we were before the commander. Comrade Betty, you two know that you can't go on behaving like children. Comrade Betty, you're disruptive. Comrade Betty acts like a child. You are a young woman, Betty, not a kid. Betty, you are a señorita. It turns out we have some disorderly comrades. Take a step forward, Comrade Betty. And I would step forward. What is it you need? Do you two want me to get you dolls so you can behave? Why are you acting like this? You two need to bring some order to your lives. I'm going to read you the code again. They read us the code over and over again. After we repeated it aloud, they punished us with gathering the firewood or guarding the animal traps. Gato would look at me, stifling his laughter. Those years were cloaked in unexpected happiness, thanks to the snails. I had them in my pockets, my hands. I stuck them to tree bark during the night, and the next day retrieved them from slightly higher on their slow escape, restarting the game. The first time I went to the shooting range and saw the circles closing around the target, I thought again of the snail, and the shot fired straight. To grow is to retreat from the center and move outward. So that is an excerpt. I hope that you all buy the anthology and read the rest of it.
Thank you.
And I think that it provides quite a bit of context, actually, about how it was written. I'll tell you that I saw these published online after a writing process that took place with co-signers of the peace agreement, or FARC ex-combatants, that was arranged by the Instituto Cardo y Cuervo, which is a government-funded literary institution in Colombia, and also by the Historic Memory Center. And it was published as a PDF collection. It was later printed. And I really was moved by all of the accounts in the collection, but particularly by this one. And I think that it was really after the signing of the peace agreement, I myself am a translator who works in the human rights field, and have translated hundreds of human rights documents, and know quite a lot from a certain perspective about the experience of the war. But this was a really new voice to me. And what really comes across is Disney's sort of youth and personality. And I think that was a really important part of the conversation to be having at that time, thinking about the context that brought people into the guerrilla at this time of, you know, when people like Disney were really making a gamble by putting down arms, and you know, thinking about the role that literature has in peace building. So this was something that I submitted to Consequence Forum. I would have never sent it into the anthology myself, to be perfectly honest. And so I really was thrilled and forever grateful to Consequence for sending it onto the anthology. I'm very grateful to the anthology for existing to highlight this work. I can tell you that Disney is thrilled that we're here having this conversation. So yeah, I think that's the background that I will provide for now. And if there are questions later, I'll be happy to.
Thank you. I think I'm also very happy about the way many of the journals had sent in entries. There are many writers who didn't know that, you know, that the journals had sent in their entries, but just the process of journals who already do the work of publishing and translating folks, you know, being able to get them across to us, I think is quite interesting. I was fascinated by the process of writing. I mean, the process you discussed there, where this person who was a former warlord and who I think you mentioned in the writing, who was both sometimes the beneficiary and sometimes a victim of the war, you know, had to come to a process of documenting his own perception and using creativity to grapple with many of the issues that, you know, they had used weapons to deal with in the past. I thought that was quite powerful. The only question I have is what did you think of what was the effect of the write-up by him and many of those who wrote, you know, participated in this writing process on the society? How was the work received, and what has been the reaction so far?
Okay. If I may, I think, would it be okay if I read from the translator's note just to sort of flesh out what you were referring to, Kola?
Yes.
Okay. Again, this is excerpted, but the concept that united the writers featured in the collection was the environment itself, and how, in the words of Juan Alvarez, project coordinator, it had been a victim, but also paradoxically a beneficiary of the armed conflict. This piece, The Snail Spiral, was written by one of the 11 co-signers of the peace agreement who participated in the writing process. So I think that it would be hard for me to say what the effect on Colombian society has been. I think that unfortunately, in spite of how important this project was, I think many people don't know about this type of initiative taking place. And I will say that it is important. Unfortunately, I mean, it shouldn't be this way, but the fact that it is being read by us in this space, and that it has sort of an external audience, will make a difference to Colombians to be able to take this kind of work seriously. And of course, I don't mean all people, but I think that what the context that's missing here is that a person like Disney, who demobilized, she faces extreme risks for having done so. So of the 14,000 combatants who demobilized in 2016, 400 have been assassinated. That includes 50 last year. Disney lives in very precarious conditions, and so of course that makes new cycles of violence or it makes it much easier, recidivism much easier. And so Disney, of course, is processing this through writing. And that's the tool that she is working with right now, the pen. And so, yeah, I would say that it's an ongoing, it's an everyday struggle. And just that the fact that Disney herself has wanted to be translated, have this project translated, says a lot about what she sees the potential of that being, I think.
Thank you very much.
If that makes sense. Sorry.
No,
Yeah.
it does, for sure.
Thank
Thank
you.
Yeah. All right, and thank you for correcting my mistaken agenda over there. Sherod is next, and he will be reading from some of his works and telling us a bit about the process as well. Over to you, Sherod.
Oh, okay. Thank you. First of all, I want to thank and admire the editors who put together this book. It seems to me quite extraordinary to have finally expanded the notion of what is literary and what is not, and the effects of doing translations of, traditionally literature has a circumscribed number of genres and stuff. And one of the things that I thought was wonderful about this anthology is that those borders are sort of thrown away, and anything that seems to have a kind of value at both the human and political and aesthetic level is something that is worthy of being brought under the umbrella of literature. And also the four of you co-editors, the introduction I thought was remarkable in a way of talking about translation and its various purposes. And Jeanine just referred to, the effect that translation has on the immediate effect that translation has on political situations, and the way you all break down the translation as something that has, there's a sort of authorized version of the original text, and then there's a political subversion as a form of translation of the original text as well. And then there are texts, as was the one with Jeanine, which addresses through the voice of somebody directly involved in this in both the context and the language of that circumstance. So really thought it was a wonderful introduction, and how brave and imaginative of you all to come up with this idea for it. I greatly admire you and all the people at Deep Vellum and Three Web Books. It's just a remarkable undertaking, and I'm sure it must have been a huge labor, but also it's a huge addition to our English-speaking readers, and so I'm very grateful to you all, and of course very grateful to be included in it. So, and thank you all. And I think the other thing the anthology shows is how each generation needs a new translation. That the idea of bringing forward a translation, original text from one generation to another is a way of refreshing our own language, but also as a way of perhaps peeling away some of the conventions that have been attached to the original text as it travels through time. So it's just a masterful thing you've done. Now, to my own translation, it's from the early Greek lyric poets, is the book that I worked on for far too many years. And so it goes back to a particular period in the history of Western literature, when somewhere around 3,000 years ago, the sort of oral traditions of the epic and Homer and so on were the predominant genre, so to speak, of poetry. And so out of this shadow of, warring soldiers and mythological, gods and monsters and otherworldly creatures, there suddenly appears, I mean, there's no sort of transition for this. It just suddenly evolves out of that. And from this sort of grand, as I say, otherworldly spectacle, there suddenly arrives the life-size human figure suddenly steps into the light in the form of the lyric poem, which dares to posit the notion that the lives of ordinary people in their ordinary daily routines is a subject worthy of poetry. Sappho says, watching her lover walk across flagstones after a rain, and she would much rather see the footprints, her footprints on the flagstones, than she would to see an eminence, a mountain filled with soldiers, the sun reflecting off the shields, that she would much rather see her lover's footprints on the flagstones. And that's sort of where this genre came from. It's just the strangest thing. And it went on from, about 700 BC to up to past the Romans. And anyway, a long span of time. And now the lyric is in some ways the predominant form of poetry, not only in the West, but in the East as well. The East came to it much earlier than the Greeks did. But anyway, so the two poems I'm going to read were written by a poet named Leonidas of Tarentum, who was it's very hard to describe him. He was, unknown and unrecognized in his day. He was a poor wanderer who, just sort of wandered around the coast of Apulia, and, nobody paid him much attention, and his work was not much read. And his poems showed little interest in, high diction or dramatic tales or heroic accomplishments. And for him, it was, what's sitting right next to him, and, going down to the harbor and buying sprats for dinner, and, heartbreak and the shadows on your pillow and that kind of stuff. So the language he chose, instead of the sort of high diction of classical poetry, was the, sort of workaday language of field hands and cobblers and vendors and cooks, what he called the community of workers. And those were his life. And so for him to sit on a rock and watch, herons picking for fish was an event that was a worthy subject for poetry. So I'm going to read two very small poems, as all of his poems were. And the first one is called Grazing Land, which is the one in the anthology. And I thank you all for picking it. Grazing Land, unherded through the icy twilight, and ones and twos, the slow-gaited cattle come down from the drifted hills, snow-blind and blackened by a lightning strike. The cowherd sits upright by an ilex tree. And then another one I thought I would read, it's called Mice. And so to talk about how all subjects are worthy of poetry in his mind, this one is about mice. If it weren't for the fact that you gnaw and scratch at the latch of my hollow meal bin, I'd think you skittery creatures must feed on the dark. An old man is content with 2 barley cakes and some sea salt, the sum my father figured was our lot in life. You'll never find a crumb on these bare floors, so why keep me awake all night, then leave me to sweep up your turds? Wouldn't a rich man offer you a better meal? So that's. Thank you all. Oops, you're muted or
Cole, I
on.
think you're muted.
Oh, me or him?
I was muted.
Oh, okay.
Thank you for that. I was going to ask you, is there a difference between, or are there complementary features between what we call the pastoral poetry and the lyric poetry, or is it just a matter of the form?
Yeah, pastoral, I think, refers generally where there's a landscape involved.
Right.
And these poems are by no means representative of lyric poetry as a whole. They were just poems that were a group of poets I had translated and I had a particular fondness for because of their humble nature.
Right.
But lyric poetry can, because it's a short form doesn't mean that it can't take on large subjects and subjects of great dramatic consequence. But, you think of poems in the life of any contemporary or modern poet from any country, and it seems as though the shorter form is more expressive of the circumstances of a person's life than it would have been in a time of, mythology and the epic. And so this idea that we have claimed for ourselves the right to write about our lives. Now, it may be lives, as in Jeanine's case, that are, involved in broader conflicts and broader encounters. And that's certainly the case with Edith as well. So they aren't, Jeanine, I didn't mean to suggest that yours is a lyric poem, but just the context of now that we can, thank God, call them literature, then you sort of see that this is somebody speaking about his or her life in a way that is both an encounter with the daily facts of that existence and yet engaged with larger issues as well. So it's a shrinking of the physical side, but not necessarily a shrinking of the subject matter or the emotional range or what have you.
Were they often read out loud? Because when we think of lyric, we think of music as well.
Yeah. The tradition it grew out of was an oral tradition, so it could only be passed along by song. And we're talking about thousands and thousands of lines of poetry that were only passed on by memory. So people would gather around these huge fires and someone would be able to recite, I don't know if they would recite all thousands of them, but I actually had a chance to hear a video recording of some shepherds in Greece who were singing Homer aloud, without a text. And this is, within the last 50 years. And it was the most remarkable thing to see. I mean, they call ancient Greek a dead language as opposed to an extinct language, meaning that it's no longer, the dead language is no longer used in the country of its origin, but it's still alive, it's still spoken, but rarely. Now, when it moved to the lyric, it's only sung as well, and it's sung, it's sung in marketplaces and it's sung in hayfields when people, gather after a harvest. And it's normally accompanied by something like a harp, what was called the aeolus in those days. And people would tap their feet as they listen. It's sort of like listening to music these days when you happen to be somewhere and you can hear it in the background. And so the poets would go in and they would, and the other remarkable thing is because you're reflecting the daily lives of the people around you, these had great political power to say, this is what's going on around us, and this is who's causing this. And so the poems were, just as you all were talking about, a source of political power, a source of speaking back. And so anyway, I've gone on enough. Let's get back.
I have one last question. I'm going to hand over to Spencer, and it's about what you mentioned in the author's note about the challenge of translating an old work that has been sort of set as a classic into contemporary language, where it's then subject to debate as to, why did you change this meaning, or are you taking it away from the context and stuff like that? How did you deal with that? in your work.
There's an ancient divide between, the scholarly belief that you should never tamper with a classical text and the poet's approach to poetry, which is the belief that something beautiful once can go on being beautiful now. And in order to achieve that, that means that you have to infuse the language with something because the meters are different, the accents are different in the original languages. So, a poem has to feel before it means. And so rather than saying literary, literal, faithful, unfaithful, they're interactive. I mean, I could never have done this book without huge reliance on the, prose renderings of poems and myriad translations and scholarly, exegesis about what lines mean and so on. But, they can either remain frozen on the page as something that, that archaeological dig to get to them. But, we need to, as I said before, every generation needs a new translation because it has to be brought into our language. I mean, we want people not just to read it as an artifact, but to experience it as a sensual experience of language, imagery, and so on.
Thank you so much. I've had a great time listening to everyone. I am sure there are some questions. Spencer, over to you. Let's take it off from here.
Thank you very much, Kola, and thank you for steering this ship. I just want to thank Sherod, Edith, and Jeanine. Those were really wonderful readings. I loved hearing the context for these pieces and also a little bit about your work. For those of you listening, please, we'd love to hear your questions. You can either write those in the chat at the bottom of your screen, or you can submit. There's a Q&A window as well where you can submit those questions. Either way, we will see them. And while we're waiting for some of those to come in, I did want to ask all of our contributors, and starting with Edith, all three of you are at various are at different parts of your careers as translators, or you work in other fields and you translate on the side. And I'm just curious, what does being included in an anthology like this mean to you? Like, what was what does that mean for where you are now in your work?
Yeah, I can start. So I didn't know I had been nominated for the anthology. So when I got the email, it was the most wonderful surprise. I couldn't believe it. I'm very much at the beginning of my career as well. So to have someone say, oh, your translation is interesting or good is incredibly affirming, because I think also, translation can be such a solitary process. And, obviously I have a lot of colleagues and classmates who will read my work and we'll talk about choices, and I collaborate a lot with the author, but at the same time, you're often working in a vacuum for a lot of the process. And so it was really affirming to know that the work was resonating with other folks. I think also too, as an early career translator, I picked a work that I personally love and feel excited to spend years of my time with.
Mm-hmm.
But it's really exciting to know that the work is resonating with other people too. And so, yeah, it's a huge thing as a new translator. And yeah, I also, so I'm getting my PhD, so I translate both on the side when I can, but also I'm writing about Daniela's work for my dissertation. So I feel like translation's been a huge part of that, because it gives me the opportunity to sit really deeply with her work and think about her work in a way that's very different from a kind of academic engagement with it. So I love getting to translate her because it allows for me to engage with her work in a way that's related to, but also very different from the kind of academic work that I'm doing with her poetry. I also thought, Rod, what you said, I wrote it down on my computer because I loved it so much, about how a poem has to feel before it means. And I'm coming from a complet department where so often we're thinking about meaning. And so translation and doing the translation allows me to kind of tap into that, the way that the poetry feels to me, in a way that I don't always get to think about when I'm doing a more kind of scholarly approach to the work. Hopefully my scholarly work does that as well, but yeah, it's nice to have different ways to tap into it. So yeah.
May I ask a question? Are you a poet as well?
You know, I am not. I had never identified as a poet, but I write poems every morning. I love
There you go. I mean,
yeah.
it's only
He's in the
to do it.
closet.
Being
Yeah.
a poet is something, God forbid anybody should be a poet. But
A secret poet.
yeah.
But yeah, but this that's also why I love translation, because I think it's allowed me to tap into a part that I had previously seen as perhaps separate from my academic work. And so I've really loved that as well.
And it's a great teacher translating poetry. I think it's a great teacher about writing itself for a poet. So
Absolutely.
good for
Yeah,
you.
thank you, Edith.
Thank you.
Jeanine, did you want to answer as well?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what you answered, Edith, resonates with me. I am a mid-career translator interpreter. So as I mentioned, I really have been dealing with a lot of non-literary text most of my career, and the desire to do this translation was motivated, even though it's not poetry, it very much was that need to feel through these issues in different ways. That's what Disney was doing, and that's what I was doing as well when I decided I wanted to translate it. And it does allow you, yeah, translation is a teacher for sure. And for me, it's given me more confidence, of course, having been selected for the anthology, to consider myself a true blue literary translator. I think that it was also very important for consequence. So these, smaller literary journals who really go out on a limb, because, we translators are not supposedly, what we do is quite simple, or there are not many people out there, especially in the US context, who understand or appreciate what it is we do and the complexity. And so I think just the importance of this anthology to the literary ecosystem is immense. And yeah, that's what I would add.
Does Disney think of it as a literary text as well? I mean, I know your translation is a literary translation. Did she think of it as a literary text, and you were, or is that too stupid a question to?
I think she absolutely did. I mean, she wrote it in the context of a creative writing course. So for that reason, but beyond that, I mean, later in the piece, she talks about everything she had to do to be able to acquire notebooks and to be able to have a literary writing practice. So I think that there was a great deal of intention. Yeah.
Well, there's no question reading your translation that it's a literary text, whatever that means, and you can tell that this is something that was in the original that you were trying to capture, was that sort of literary quality, which is,
yeah,
just call it a matter of words and the way they're put together and the effects they are reaching for. So yeah.
Thanks, Rod.
It's wonderful to have.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Jeanine.
Wide range of.
Yeah, and then Rod. I mean, you're the author of and translator of 7 different books. I mean, obviously, and you've been working in the Greek for a long time. And then I'd love to hear also, what this inclusion means for you.
Oh God, for it being an inaugural book, for what it is, I mean, this is an extraordinary addition to our literature. And by the very fact that the 3 of us who are here are sort of people picked out of the anthology, the different kinds of work that we're translating, how do I put this? Anthologies tend to have a kind of sameness to them, best of or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Not sameness, not monotonous, but nothing on the scale of stretching the idea of literary genres that this has. And it's completely blew me away when I read through it the first time, and I thought, I've never read anything quite like this. Do you all have the same experience about what's included, Jeanine and Edith? Do you, I'd never seen anything quite like it, and the idea that it's an inaugural issue makes it all the more special for me, and I'm sure for the others as well, to be included in it.
Thank you, Rod. And then Kola, we actually have a question for you from an attendee who asks, like, when you were when you were assembling submissions for the anthology, did you notice any themes or threads throughout these submissions as you were working with your fellow editors to compile?
So yeah, one of the things Sherod mentioned, the idea that unlike the best poetry or best prose, here we're working with all genres, and in each of these genres there's so many different levels of complexity and difference, and having to read through hundreds of works and choose which one strikes you the most. I mean, we had a grading system, okay? So the four of us had to read, a series and then rate them, and then everyone had to look at every other person's lists and then decide, add their own rating as well. So in the end, by the time we then count all the ratings, it kind of reflects each person's preference as well as the collective mind's preference. So it's not just one person deciding on the work. And what I found, in answering the question is that there's so many themes. It's as diverse, as varied as, the people who sent in entries. And you're looking at so many things, not just, you're looking at the quality of the translation, of course, but also does the story itself strike you, in a way? And is this something that's interesting enough for other people to want to read? And you may have your own reasons for liking a particular thing, and some other person likes it for a totally different reason, but they like it anyway, or they don't even like it at all. For some reason or the other. So we go through many of these things. It's when we finally now select the short lists and you look at it again and you realize that, oh, this is quite a wide breadth of submissions from so many different places. And events like this, and sometimes because you've read so many, you don't remember all of them. But sometimes in close events like this, when you get to interact, or sometimes I sit down and just flip to one random page and read again and I realize that, this is actually quite a significant piece of work that has, come in. And you sometimes see things you didn't see the first time. You're happy that, the work is there. So it's one of those things, one of those private pleasures of, being able to be at the forefront of, selecting, for the world to read, particular works that have struck you in very significant ways. I found that quite interesting and a privilege, so to speak. And I should mention, Sherod was thanking us for the work, that it's a collective work, and it's a very grueling work to have to read all of this stuff, but the team makes it quite easy. So I want to also thank again, before we go, Wendy and No and Oiko, who make this work delightful, and whose brain and collective passion for this work also makes it so successful, and all our guest editors as well. Thanks.
Excellent. That is a wonderful place to leave things off. I want to thank Rod, Edith, and Jeanine, and of course, Kola, for joining us today. I'm already looking forward to the next anthology, who you said would be guest edited by Cristina Rivera Garza. Oh, that's gonna be killer. I love it. So thank you everyone for watching. Thank you to our translators today. Please, if you're in Seattle, join us in the store. We'd love to see you at Third Place Books. And other than that, please be well, everyone, and take care.
Nice to see you all. Thank you again.
Thank you. This was great.
Thank you so much.
Hi, Jeanine,
Yeah,
Edith,
I really enjoyed that.
Spencer.
Have a great night, everyone.
You all represent our profession well. Thank you.